Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the kind of cold that makes your eyelashes freeze together. The bone-deep, soul-testing cold of the Yamal Peninsula in northwestern Siberia, where you're about to spend 24 hours as a Nenets reindeer herder. Picture this. It's 4:30 in the morning, it's negative 42 degrees Celsius outside, and you're wrapped in layers of reindeer fur inside a conical tent that's essentially held together by hope, sinew, and about 3,000 years of accumulated cultural knowledge. The wind is howling across the tundra like it's personally offended by your existence, and somewhere beyond the hide walls of your chum, 800 reindeer are shuffling and snorting in the darkness, their collective body heat creating little clouds of steam that vanish into the Arctic night. You probably won't survive this if you forget even one of the dozen daily rituals that keep you alive out here, and honestly, your ancestors would be disappointed if you did. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. I'm always curious who's joining me for these midnight history rambles. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're stirring awake inside your chum, though awake is maybe too strong a word for what's happening to your consciousness right now. It's more like your body is dragging your mind back from wherever it wandered during the night, protesting every step of the way. The interior of the tent is dim, lit only by the dying embers of the central fire, and you can see your breath materializing in front of your face in thick white puffs. That's your first clue that the fire needs attention. When you can see your breath inside the chum, it means the temperature has dropped below the threshold of uncomfortable and slid well into potentially dangerous. You're lying on a sleeping platform made of birch branches covered with multiple layers of reindeer hide, and you're cocooned in a sleeping bag that's also made from reindeer fur. Everything here is reindeer. Your mattress, reindeer. Your blanket, reindeer. Your coat hanging by the entrance, reindeer. The Nenets people have somewhere around 40 different words for reindeer in various states and contexts, which makes sense when you consider that reindeer aren't just livestock here, they're currency, transportation, food, clothing, shelter, and the entire foundation of your culture going back millennia. You pull yourself upright, and every joint in your body makes its complaints known. Sleeping on the tundra isn't like sleeping on a Tempur-Pedic, even with all the furs and hides. The cold has a way of seeping into your bones overnight, and that first movement of the day always feels like you're 100 years old. Your wife is already moving around near the fire. She woke up 20 minutes before you, as she always does, to start nursing the flames back to life. She's adding small pieces of driftwood that you collected 3 days ago from a riverbank, rationing each piece because wood is precious out here on the treeless tundra. The wood crackles and pops as it catches, sending little sparks spiraling upward toward the smoke hole at the tent's apex. The chum itself is an engineering marvel that doesn't get nearly enough credit in mainstream discussions of historical architecture. It's a conical structure about 15 feet in diameter at the base, made from roughly 40 wooden poles that lean inward and meet at the top, all covered with reindeer hide panels that you can roll up or down depending on the weather. The Nenets have been perfecting this design for at least 2,000 years, and possibly much longer. Archaeologists still argue whether certain Bronze Age tent rings found in Siberia represent Proto-Nenets culture or an entirely different group. You swing your legs off the sleeping platform and immediately regret it as your feet touch the frozen ground through your thick wool socks. The earth beneath the chum never really thaws, even in summer. This is permafrost country, where the soil has been frozen solid for thousands of years and goes down hundreds of feet. You fumble for your boots in the semi-darkness, finding them where you left them last night, stuffed with dried grass to absorb moisture and keep them from freezing into unusable blocks of leather. These aren't just any boots. They're traditional Nenets mukluks made from reindeer leg skin, with the fur facing outward and elaborate embroidery around the tops that your wife stitched during last winter's long nights. The soles are made from the thick skin of a reindeer's forehead, which is apparently the toughest part of the animal and can withstand the constant friction of walking on ice and frozen ground. You pull them on, wrapping the leather ties around your calves in the specific pattern that your father taught you, the one that keeps snow from getting in while still allowing enough circulation that your feet don't go numb. Your 4-year-old daughter is still sleeping on the platform across from yours, buried so deep in furs that you can barely see her face. She'll wake up in another hour, when the chum has warmed enough that consciousness feels less like punishment. Your teenage son is already gone. You can see the disturbed furs where he was sleeping, which means he's already outside checking on the herd's perimeter. He's at that age where he's desperate to prove he can handle adult responsibilities, which is both helpful and occasionally terrifying when those responsibilities include navigating whiteout conditions and discouraging wolves. The Nenets people have one of the lowest average ages for assuming full adult duties of any culture that's been studied. Boys as young as 12 are sometimes trusted with managing portions of the herd, though historians still argue whether this represents cultural sophistication or economic necessity born from harsh conditions. You pull on your militsa, which is essentially a reindeer fur parka that reaches your knees, with the fur facing inward for maximum insulation. Over that goes your sovak, another fur coat with the fur facing outward this time, creating a double-layered system that traps warm air between the two garments. It sounds excessive until you remember that it's -42 outside and you're about to spend the entire day outdoors. Your wife hands you a cup of hot tea without saying anything. This early in the morning, words feel like too much effort, and besides, you've been married for 16 years and have developed that telepathic communication system that long-term couples use. The tea is brick tea from China, dark and bitter, and mixed with a chunk of reindeer fat that melts into the liquid and coats your throat as you drink. It tastes exactly like what it is: survival calories wrapped in a hot delivery system. You're not drinking this for enjoyment, you're drinking it because you're about to burn about 5,000 calories today just existing in this environment, and you need every advantage you can get. The fire is going strong now, and the temperature inside the chum has climbed from meat locker to refrigerator, which counts as progress. Your wife is preparing the morning's bread, mixing flour with melted snow water and a bit of stored fat, patting it into flat discs that she'll cook on a metal pan salvaged from who knows where. The Nenets have been trading with outsiders for centuries: Russian merchants, Chinese traders, even medieval Arab travelers reported encountering far northern herders with surprising collections of exotic goods. That pan might have come from a trading post 300 miles away, or it might have been passed down through 5 generations of your wife's family. Everything here has a story, and everything gets used until it literally disintegrates. Outside, you can hear the herd starting to become more active as dawn approaches. 800 reindeer make a surprising amount of noise when they all start moving at once. Grunting, snorting, the clicking sound their leg tendons make as they walk, which is apparently unique to reindeer and helps them stick together during whiteout conditions. That clicking sound is so distinctive that experienced herders can estimate the size of a herd and its general health just by listening to it from a distance, though scientists only recently figured out the anatomical mechanism that produces it. You drain the last of your tea and hand the cup back to your wife, who's already preparing a second round for when you come back from your first check of the herd. This routine is so embedded in your daily life that you could do it in your sleep, which is good because you're essentially doing it in your sleep right now, operating on autopilot while your consciousness slowly boots up like a frozen computer. You push aside the hide flap that serves as the chum's door and step out into the pre-dawn darkness. The cold hits you like a physical force, slamming into your face and finding every microscopic gap in your clothing. Your nose hairs freeze instantly, and your first breath out creates a cloud of ice crystals that sparkle in the faint light from the tent behind you. The sky is that particular shade of deep blue-black that happens in the Arctic during winter, with stars so bright and numerous that they look fake, like someone went overboard with the glitter at a school play. The aurora is doing its thing in the northern sky, pale green curtains waving and shimmering like cosmic laundry, but you barely glance at it because you've seen the northern lights approximately 10,000 times in your life and they're honestly just part of the background now. Tourists pay thousands of dollars to see what you consider basic atmospheric conditions. The herd is spread out across the tundra in front of you, darker shapes against dark ground, their breath creating a low-lying fog that hovers about 3 feet above the snow. Your son is visible as a small figure on the far side of the herd, walking the perimeter with a long pole. He's doing exactly what he should be doing, which fills you with a complicated mixture of pride and sadness because it means he's learning well, but it also means he's locked into this life just like you were, just like your father was, going back generation after generation into the mists of prehistory. The Nenets people are one of the few remaining fully nomadic cultures on Earth, moving their herds across a migration route that covers more than 1,000 kilometers each year. And that lifestyle is increasingly difficult to maintain in a world of climate change, oil development, and pressure from governments that would really prefer everyone to settle down in nice, taxable permanent settlements. But that's a problem for daylight hours. Right now, you have more immediate concerns, like making sure none of your 800 reindeer decided to wander off during the night or get picked off by wolves. You can see your breath hanging in the air in front of you as you start walking toward the herd, each exhale immediately crystallizing and falling to the ground with a faint tinkling sound. This is the coldest hour of the day, that pre-dawn period when the temperature drops those last few degrees and everything feels brittle and breakable, including you. Your eyelashes are already starting to stick together with frost, and you blink rapidly to keep them from freezing shut. Welcome to your office. Your commute is about 50 steps, and your dress code is wrap yourself in dead animals or die. The health insurance is non-existent, but the views are spectacular, and you've never had to sit through a single corporate team-building exercise. There are worse ways to live, you suppose, though right at this moment, as the wind picks up and drives tiny ice crystals into your face like microscopic needles, you're having trouble thinking of any. Word count, 2087. You continue walking toward the nearest group of reindeer, and they shift and move as you approach. Not spooked but aware of your presence in that way herd animals always are. These aren't wild caribou. They're semi-domesticated reindeer that have been bred and managed by your people for at least 2,000 years, possibly longer. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about when exactly the Nenets transitioned from hunting wild reindeer to herding domestic ones, with some archaeologists pointing to evidence as far back as the first millennium BCE, while others argue for a later domestication date around 500 to 800 CE. What everyone agrees on is that the relationship between the Nenets and their reindeer is unlike typical livestock management. It's more like a negotiated partnership where the reindeer provide everything you need to survive, and in return, you protect them from predators, guide them to the best grazing, and generally ensure their continued survival as a species. You count heads automatically as you move through the herd, a habit so ingrained that you're barely conscious you're doing it. 23 in this cluster, including 2 calves from last spring that are now lanky adolescents with their first real antlers coming in. One of the older females has a slight limp that you make a mental note to check later when there's better light. It's probably nothing serious, maybe just a stone bruise on her hoof, but in this environment, probably nothing serious can become definitely serious in a matter of hours if you ignore it. The reindeer are already wearing their winter coats, which makes them look substantially fatter than they actually are. Their fur is hollow, filled with air pockets that provide incredible insulation, which is why your clothes are made from it. A healthy reindeer can maintain its core body temperature in weather that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The snow beneath your feet is that peculiar squeaky texture it gets when temperatures drop below -30, making a characteristic crunching sound with each step. This is the sound of ice crystals breaking under pressure, too cold to melt even momentarily from the heat and weight of your body. You've walked on this kind of snow your entire life, and you can read it like other people read newspapers. This particular squeak tells you that the temperature dropped sharply around 3 in the morning and has stayed steady since then. The hardness of the surface tells you that there hasn't been fresh snowfall in about 36 hours. The faint crust about 4 inches down, which you can feel through your boots when you step, marks where a brief warming period occurred 5 days ago before the cold came crashing back. Your son appears out of the gloom, walking toward you with that slightly bow-legged gait that all herders develop from spending their entire lives walking on uneven, snow-covered ground. He's wearing his own militsa and sovak, looking like a smaller, younger version of you, which makes sense because that's literally what he is. "All clear on the north side," he says, his voice slightly muffled by the fur-lined hood pulled up around his face. "I heard something in the distance about an hour ago. Might have been wolves, but they didn't come close." You nod because that's about what you expected to hear. Wolves are a constant presence out here, and they're smart enough to test the herd's defenses regularly, looking for weak spots. A sick reindeer, a straggler, an inattentive herder. But they're also smart enough to know that a healthy, well-guarded herd isn't worth the effort, especially when there are wild prey options available. Your mother is making bread, you tell him, which is code for go eat something before you collapse, but phrased in a way that doesn't sound like you're worried about him, because teenage boys respond very poorly to expressions of parental concern. He nods and heads back toward the chum, and you continue your circuit of the herd, checking for anything unusual, counting heads, making sure the weak ones are clustered in the middle where they're protected from both cold and predators. This is your morning meditation, your yoga practice, your commute. This slow walk through the herd as the sky gradually lightens from black to deep blue to that peculiar gray-white that passes for daylight in Arctic winter. Your grandfather did this. Your great-grandfather did this. Your ancestors going back dozens of generations did this. Walking through herds of reindeer in the pre-dawn cold, counting and watching and making sure everyone survived another night. The sky is lightening now, that slow Arctic dawn that takes forever because the sun has to climb at such a shallow angle. You can start to make out actual details instead of just shapes. Individual reindeer faces, the texture of the snow, the low scrubby vegetation poking through where the wind has blown the cover thin. This is your world. This frozen expanse that looks like nothing to outsiders, but contains everything you know and love. And in a few minutes, when there's enough light to see properly, the real work of the day will begin. The sun isn't actually rising yet. Calling it sunrise would be generous when you're this far north in December. But there's enough ambient light now that you can see the full extent of your herd spread across the tundra like a living blanket. 800 reindeer in various shades of brown, gray, and white, some standing, some still lying down in the snow, all of them engaged in the primary reindeer activity of existing in a cold place while being slightly suspicious of everything. You need to count them properly now, not just the quick head counts you've been doing, but an actual census that accounts for every animal and assesses their condition. This is one of those tasks that sounds straightforward until you realize you're trying to count 800 nearly identical animals that won't stop moving, in weather that makes your eyes water, while maintaining enough focus that you don't accidentally count the same reindeer twice or miss one entirely. You start with the castrated males, the geldings, because they're the easiest to identify and tend to cluster together in their own social groups. Castrated reindeer are the backbone of Nenets herding because they're calmer than bulls, stronger than females, and they don't waste energy on the drama of mating season. You count 47 in the main gelding group, which is exactly what you should have, and you can identify most of them individually by their antler shapes, their movement patterns, or the specific combination of ear notches that mark them as yours. Every Nenets family has their own marking system, cuts and notches in specific patterns that serve as a kind of living brand registry going back centuries. Your family's marks are 3 notches on the right ear and 2 on the left, a pattern your great-great-grandfather established and that now identifies several thousand reindeer across the peninsula as belonging to your extended family network. The marking system is actually a fascinating piece of cultural technology that doesn't get enough attention. Before you think, oh, how quaint, they cut their animals' ears. Which, yes, sounds brutal. Consider that this is a property ownership system that works across a 1,000-kilometer migration route without any written records, contracts, or government registration. When herds mix, which happens constantly because reindeer are social animals that would really prefer to all hang out together, you can sort them back out by reading their ears like barcodes. The system is so sophisticated that there are traditional arbitrators who specialize in settling disputes about ear marks, and their decisions are respected across the entire Nenets community. Historians still argue whether this represents an indigenous form of customary law or something even more complex. You move on to the breeding bulls, counting them carefully because they're your most valuable animals and also the most likely to cause problems. You have 17 bulls this year, which is a good ratio for a herd this size. Enough genetic diversity to keep the calves healthy, not so many that they spend all their time fighting each other for dominance. Bulls are magnificent and also completely insufferable during the fall rutting season, when they lose about 30% of their body weight, stop eating, and dedicate themselves entirely to being aggressive idiots. You're past that season now, thankfully, and the bulls have settled back into being merely occasionally problematic instead of constantly problematic. One of them, a massive gray male you've mentally named Bad Decision because of his consistent poor judgment, is standing slightly apart from the others, and you make a mental note to watch him today. Bulls who isolate themselves are either sick or planning something stupid, and with Bad Decision it could honestly go either way. Now comes the tedious part, counting the females. You have roughly 650 adult females, give or take, plus about 90 calves from last spring who are now almost full-grown but not quite ready to breed yet. The females are harder to count because they move in larger, more fluid groups, and they're smarter than the males about evading your attempts to organize them. Female reindeer, unlike most other deer species, grow antlers, which is an evolutionary adaptation that scientists think helps them compete for food during winter when they're pregnant and need extra calories. It's also deeply inconvenient for counting purposes because you can't just sort them by has antlers versus doesn't have antlers, like you could with most deer species. Instead, you're looking at antler size, body condition, behavior patterns, and trying to keep track of numbers that keep shifting as the animals move around. You've developed a system over the years where you mentally divide the herd into grid sections and count each section separately, using landmarks like near that big rock or by that patch of exposed lichen to keep track of where you've already counted. It's not precise, but precision is overrated when you're trying to count hundreds of mobile animals in -40-degree weather while your face gradually freezes. You count 642 females on your first pass, which is close enough to your expected number that you're not immediately panicking. You'll do another count at midday and another at evening, and by averaging those 3 counts, you'll have a reasonably accurate picture of your herd's composition. If any of those counts is significantly off, that's when you start worrying about wolves, theft, or animals that have wandered off into one of the many ways a reindeer can get itself killed on the tundra. Your son reappears, looking substantially more human now that he's had bread and tea. "Mom wants to know when we're moving," he says, which is his way of asking when you're planning to break camp and continue the migration. You're currently about 40 kilometers from where you need to be by the new year, camped in a spot that has decent lichen coverage but is starting to show signs of overgrazing. The reindeer have been working this area for 3 days now, pawing through the snow to get at the lichen underneath, and you can see the trampled patches where they've stripped the vegetation down to nothing. Lichen grows incredibly slowly in the Arctic. Some of the patches you're looking at are decades old, and responsible herding means moving before you destroy the grazing for future years. Tomorrow, you tell him, after considering the grazing, the weather, and the distance to your next planned camping spot. "We'll move tomorrow morning if the weather holds." Moving an entire camp isn't something you do casually. It requires packing up the entire chum, loading everything onto sledges, and then herding 800 reindeer across open tundra while keeping them together and preventing them from deciding to go their own way. It's an all-day affair that requires perfect coordination, calm weather, and a certain amount of luck. But staying here much longer will damage the grazing and risk running out of lichen entirely, which would mean hungry reindeer and all the problems that come with that. You continue your inspection, walking among the reindeer and checking individuals for signs of illness or injury. This is the part of herding that requires real expertise, the ability to spot subtle changes in behavior or appearance that indicate a problem before it becomes a crisis. You're looking for reindeer that are standing apart from the herd, which could indicate illness. You're checking for limps, favored legs, unusual head positions that might indicate ear infections or other problems. You're watching how they breathe, looking for labored respiration that could indicate pneumonia, which can tear through a herd with devastating speed if you don't catch it early. One of the younger females has a slight discharge from her nose that you don't like the look of. It's probably just irritation from the cold air. Reindeer noses run in cold weather just like human noses do, but it could also be the beginning of respiratory infection. You make a mental note to check her again this afternoon and isolate her if the discharge gets worse. Veterinary care on the tundra is mostly preventative and mostly relies on knowledge that's been passed down through generations. You don't have antibiotics out here, and even if you did, administering medicine to a semi-wild reindeer is harder than it sounds. What you have is knowledge of which plants have medicinal properties, which animals are strong enough to fight off illness on their own, and when the kindest thing to do is butcher a sick animal before it suffers further or spreads disease to the rest of the herd. The calves are all looking good, fat and healthy despite the cold. Reindeer calves are absurdly cute when they're born in the spring, long-legged and wobbly and covered in soft fur. But by December they're basically small adults, capable of keeping up with the herd and surviving the winter. You count 87 calves, which means you've lost 3 since the fall count. That's actually better than expected. Calf mortality in Arctic conditions can easily hit 20%. And those 3 losses were all from natural causes as far as you could tell. 1 got sick, 1 fell through thin ice, and 1 was taken by a wolverine despite your best efforts at prevention. Wolverines are the honey badgers of the Arctic, fearless and vicious and capable of taking down animals much larger than themselves. You hate them with a passion that borders on irrational, but then again, when something regularly tries to kill and eat your livelihood, a little irrationality seems justified. You check hooves as you move through the herd, watching for splits, cracks, or signs of foot rot. Reindeer hooves are remarkable structures, broad and concave, perfect for walking on snow and swimming across rivers. but they're also vulnerable to injury and infection. A reindeer with bad hoofs can't keep up with the herd during migration, and a reindeer that can't keep up with the herd is a dead reindeer. You find one male with a cracked hoof that needs attention, and you spend 5 minutes cornering him, which is about as fun as it sounds, before you can get close enough to examine the damage. The crack goes about halfway up the hoof wall, not deep enough to be immediately critical, but deep enough that you need to do something about it. You pull out your knife and carefully trim away the loose edges of the crack, a procedure that the reindeer absolutely hates, but that will prevent the crack from spreading and getting infected. He kicks you twice in the process, which is pretty much par for the course when you're playing podiatrist to an animal that weighs 300 pounds and really doesn't want your help. The light is growing stronger now, that flat white illumination that passes for daylight above the Arctic Circle in winter. The sun is technically above the horizon for about 4 hours a day at this latitude in December, but above the horizon is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It's more like the sun briefly appears as a dim orange smudge on the southern horizon before giving up and disappearing again. You don't have proper daylight hours so much as you have less dark hours, which takes some psychological adjustment if you didn't grow up here. Seasonal affective disorder is a real thing, and living in a place where the sun barely shows up for 4 months of the year will test anyone's mental health. The Nenets have their own ways of coping, storytelling, elaborate social rituals, the kind of dark humor that develops in any population that regularly deals with existential threats. But it's still hard. Every winter you lose people to despair, to accidents that maybe weren't entirely accidents, to the simple grinding exhaustion of existing in an environment that's actively trying to kill you. But right now, in this moment, with your herd healthy and your family safe and the aurora still faintly visible in the northern sky, you can appreciate the stark beauty of this place. The tundra stretches away in all directions, flat and white and seemingly infinite, broken only by the occasional low hill or frozen stream. The air is so clear that you can see for dozens of kilometers, and the silence is profound, not complete silence, because the wind is always making some kind of noise and the reindeer are constantly shuffling and clicking, but the deep silence of a place far removed from human civilization. No cars, no planes, no industrial hum. Just wind and animals and the sound of your own breathing. You finish your count, 803 reindeer total, which means you either gained 3 overnight through some kind of reindeer miracle or more likely you miscounted somewhere, and head back toward the chum. Your son is already there, working with his mother to prepare more food and melt snow for water. Your daughter is awake now, peering out from her nest of furs with sleep-swollen eyes, and she waves at you as you approach. This is your life. This is your family. This is the pattern that has sustained your people for thousands of years, and you're maintaining it for one more day, one more season, one more generation. Whether your grandchildren will do the same is an open question, but that's a problem for a different time. Right now, you have 800 reindeer to keep alive, and that's more than enough to occupy your attention. The decision to move camp tomorrow means today is dedicated to preparation, and preparation means systematically dismantling your entire life and packing it onto sledges in a way that will survive being dragged across 40 kilometers of frozen tundra. You've done this hundreds of times. The Nenets people move camp anywhere from 30 to 50 times per year, following the reindeer's grazing patterns and the seasonal migration routes that have been refined over millennia, but it never becomes routine. There's always something that goes wrong, some piece of equipment that breaks at the worst possible moment, some reindeer that decides today is the day it will finally express its individuality by refusing to cooperate. Your wife is already sorting through your possessions, making quick decisions about what gets packed first and what can wait until tomorrow morning. She's been doing this since she was 7 years old, trained by her mother and grandmother in the specific art of mobile household management, and she's frighteningly efficient at it. The chum contains everything you own. Sleeping furs, cooking equipment, tools, spare clothing, food stores, religious items, and about 24 other categories of stuff that all need to be organized, packed, and loaded in the correct order. Pack things in the wrong sequence and you'll end up needing something that's buried at the bottom of a sledge under 400 pounds of other supplies, which is how you learn patience and also creative profanity. The first thing to pack is always the items you won't need until after you've reached the new campsite. The extra furs, the summer clothing that's currently useless, the tools for tasks you won't perform while traveling. These go into large bags made from reindeer hide, sewn with sinew in patterns that haven't changed in living memory. Your wife is particular about how these bags are packed, folding everything in specific ways to minimize space and prevent damage. She once spent 20 minutes explaining to your son why you fold fur garments with the hair facing inward but pack them with the hair facing outward. Something about moisture and preservation that made perfect sense at the time but that you've honestly forgotten. The point is, there are rules, and the rules exist because people learned through hard experience what works and what leads to ruined supplies and miserable camping. Your daughter is helping, which at age 4 means she's mostly getting in the way while occasionally moving small items from one pile to another pile, completely destroying whatever organizational system was in place. Your wife tolerates this with the patience of someone who knows that this is how children learn, by participating badly in adult tasks until they gradually get better at them. In 5 or 6 years, your daughter will be genuinely useful during packing. In 10 years, she'll be faster at it than you are. For now, she's adorable and counterproductive, and you step around her as you start taking down the outer hide panels of the chum. The chum comes apart in a specific sequence, and deviating from that sequence leads to chaos. You start by removing the hide panels from the outside, working your way around the structure and rolling each panel carefully to prevent damage. These panels are heavy. Each one weighs about 25 pounds, and they're stiff with cold, making them awkward to handle. You work quickly because exposed hide will frost over if left in contact with cold air too long, and frosty hide won't pack properly. Each panel has to be checked for damage as you remove it. Holes, tears, weak spots where the hide is wearing thin. Your wife will repair minor damage tonight by firelight, stitching with sinew and waterproofing with a mixture of reindeer fat and birch tar that smells absolutely horrible, but works remarkably well at keeping moisture out. Historians still argue whether the Nenets chum design influenced other tent structures across northern Eurasia, or whether similar designs developed independently in response to similar environmental pressures. The teepee of the North American plains is structurally similar, and so are several other nomadic tent designs from Mongolia and Central Asia, which has led to some interesting scholarly debates about cultural diffusion versus convergent evolution. What's not debatable is that the chum works. It's stable in high winds, provides excellent insulation despite having no solid walls, and can be assembled or disassembled by 2 adults in about 4 hours. That's not just impressive. That's the difference between life and death when you need to move camp ahead of a storm. The wooden poles that form the chum's frame stay up for now. You'll take those down tomorrow morning as the absolute last step before moving, but everything else is coming down today. The sleeping platforms get dismantled, the furs get rolled and packed, the cooking equipment gets cleaned and stored. Your wife is muttering to herself as she works, a steady stream of half-voiced thoughts about what goes where and what she's forgetting. You've learned over 16 years of marriage not to interrupt this process. She's running through mental checklists that are probably more complex than most people's careers, and she doesn't need your help unless she specifically asks for it. You turn your attention to the sledges, which are stored on their sides about 50 meters from the camp. You have 4 sledges, 3 large ones for hauling supplies and 1 smaller one that serves as a combination passenger transport and emergency backup. These aren't like the recreational sleds you might be picturing. These are serious pieces of engineering, roughly 12 feet long and 3 feet wide, made from wood that was probably harvested 200 kilometers south of here and traded northward through a network of relationships that spans the entire peninsula. The runners are shod with sections of antler that have been carefully shaped and attached with leather bindings, because antler glides across snow better than wood and is more durable than you'd think. Each sledge needs to be inspected before you can trust it with a day's worth of heavy hauling. You check the runners for cracks, the crossbars for weakness, the bindings for fraying. You find 2 bindings that need replacement and 1 crossbar with a suspicious split that you'll need to reinforce with strips of wet rawhide that will shrink and tighten as they dry. This is preventative maintenance at its most literal. You fix problems before they become catastrophic failures, because catastrophic failures on the tundra tend to be, well, catastrophic. A broken sledge 40 kilometers from your destination with all your food and shelter packed on it is the kind of problem that can easily become a people die situation. Your son appears with a coil of rope over his shoulder, braided from reindeer sinew according to a technique that his grandfather taught him. Sinew rope is stronger than you'd believe possible, and it stays flexible in cold weather that would make plant fiber rope brittle and useless. He's learned to braid rope during the long winter evenings, sitting by the fire and twisting strands together while listening to stories, and the coil he's carrying represents probably 30 hours of careful work. He's proud of it in the way teenage boys are proud of things they've made with their own hands, and he should be, It's good rope, evenly braided with no weak spots. You test a section of it, pulling hard, and nod your approval. He tries not to smile but fails, because he's still young enough that parental approval matters more than looking cool. Together, you start rigging the sledges, attaching the harness points that will connect to the pulling reindeer. Each sledge is pulled by 3 to 5 reindeer depending on the load and the terrain, and the harness arrangement is more complicated than you'd think. The reindeer need to pull in coordination without interfering with each other, and the harness needs to distribute the weight properly so no single animal is overburdened. Get the harness wrong and you'll have reindeer tangling their legs, pulling sideways instead of forward, or simply refusing to move because the whole arrangement is uncomfortable. The harness system you're using was developed over centuries of trial and error, and it's beautifully elegant in its simplicity. Just leather straps and wooden toggles, nothing fancy, but arranged in a pattern that allows 5 reindeer to pull several hundred pounds with relative ease. The harness leather needs to be checked for wear, particularly at the stress points where the straps attach to the toggles. You find 3 spots that need repair. Leather that's starting to crack from repeated flexing in extreme cold, and you set those pieces aside for your wife to stitch tonight. She's the expert at leather repair, with hands that have sewn thousands of meters of sinew through hide and leather over the years, and she can fix these stress points in a way that's actually stronger than the original construction. It's a running joke in your family that she could probably sew 2 reindeer together if she needed to, and honestly, you're not entirely sure she couldn't. Packing camp is always when you discover what's broken, worn out, or missing. Today's discoveries include 1 cooking pot with a crack that's been slowly growing for a month, 3 sections of rope that have mysteriously disappeared, probably left behind at the last campsite, 1 of your wife's good knives that has snapped its handle, and an entire bag of dried fish that has been invaded by some kind of insect despite the fact that you're in the Arctic in December and insects should be impossible. Your wife makes that particular annoyed sound that means someone is going to get blamed for the fish situation eventually, and you wisely say nothing because you have a strong survival instinct when it comes to domestic politics. The work continues through the morning, a steady rhythm of sorting, packing, checking, and repairing. Your daughter has abandoned her helping and is now playing in the snow nearby, building some kind of structure that might be a miniature chum or might be an abstract art installation. It's hard to tell with 4-year-olds. Your son is hauling bundles of packed supplies over to the sledges, building the loads in careful layers so the weight distributes properly. He's learned the hard way that improper loading leads to shifted cargo and capsized sledges, and he's more careful now than he was a year ago. You take a break to drink tea and eat some of the morning's bread, standing next to the fire and letting the heat soak into your front side while your back stays frozen. This is the eternal Arctic compromise. You're either too hot or too cold, never both comfortably warm at the same time. The bread is dense and slightly sweet, made from a combination of store-bought flour and some kind of wild plant flour that your wife collects during the brief summer months. It's not delicious by any conventional standard, but it's calories and it's warm, and that's basically the only criteria that matter out here. The herd has moved closer during the morning, attracted by the activity and the smoke from the fire. Reindeer are curious animals, and they like to know what their humans are up to, probably because they've learned through countless generations that human activity often leads to food or protection or some other benefit. A few of the bolder females are practically in the camp now, sniffing at packed bundles and generally being nosy. Your wife shoos them away with a piece of firewood, not hard enough to hurt them, but firmly enough to communicate that they're not welcome in the packing area. One of them, a particularly stubborn female you've mentally named Opinion, because she always has one, refuses to leave and stands there giving your wife what can only be described as a judgmental look. Your wife stares her down in a contest of wills that lasts almost a minute before Opinion finally snorts and wanders off with the air of someone who chose to leave rather than being forced. By early afternoon, most of the packing is done. The sledges are loaded and covered with hides to protect the cargo from wind and snow. The chum is stripped down to just its pole frame and a few essential items that you'll need tonight and tomorrow morning. Everything that can be prepared ahead of time has been prepared, and all that remains is getting through the rest of today, sleeping tonight, and then executing the actual move tomorrow. You stand back and survey the organized chaos of your camp, and you feel that particular satisfaction that comes from having done difficult work well. Tomorrow will be hard. Moving day is always hard, but you're ready for it, and that's as much as anyone can ask. Tomorrow morning turned into this morning somewhere during a fitful night's sleep, and now you're standing in the pre-dawn darkness watching your breath crystallize, while mentally preparing for the logistical nightmare that is moving 800 reindeer and all your worldly possessions across 40 kilometers of frozen tundra. The temperature has dropped even further overnight. You'd estimate it's around -45 now, cold enough that the snow squeaks like styrofoam under your boots, and your first breath of outside air makes your lungs ache in protest. This is not ideal moving weather, but then again, there's no such thing as ideal moving weather in December on the Yamal Peninsula. There's just possible and suicidal, and you've determined that today falls into the former category, barely. Your wife is taking down the last of the chum's interior components while simultaneously keeping your daughter entertained and fed, which is the kind of multitasking that deserves some kind of award but will receive no recognition whatsoever because this is just normal life. Your son is already out with the herd, identifying which reindeer will serve as sledge pullers today. You need about 18 reindeer total for the 4 sledges. Some will be harnessed, others will serve as backups in case someone gets injured or decides to be difficult, and choosing the right animals is crucial. Pick lazy reindeer and you'll be dragging sledges yourself. Pick aggressive ones and they'll spend the entire day fighting each other instead of pulling. Pick ones that aren't well trained to harness and you'll waste hours just getting them hooked up. The ideal sledge reindeer is a castrated male between 4 and 8 years old enough to have filled out and developed real strength, young enough to still have energy and good joints. They need to be used to humans, comfortable with harness, and socially compatible with the other pulling reindeer. Finding 18 animals that meet all these criteria from a herd of 800 is like trying to assemble a sports team where half the players don't speak your language and the other half might try to headbutt each other. Your son is good at this, though, better than you were at his age. He's spent his entire conscious life reading reindeer behavior, and he can spot a good puller from 50 meters away just by watching how it moves through the herd. You help him cut out the chosen animals. Cutting being the herding term for separating specific individuals from the main group, and it's as difficult as it sounds. Reindeer have a strong herd instinct and really don't want to be separated from their friends. You end up doing a lot of running, waving your arms, and making yourself large and intimidating while trying not to slip on the ice and fall on your face, which would ruin your authority considerably. It takes about 45 minutes to separate 18 reindeer from the main herd and get them into a loose group near the sledges, and by the end of it you're sweating despite the cold and your legs are burning from the effort. Now comes the fun part, harnessing. And by fun, you mean deeply frustrating activity that tests your patience and your vocabulary of swear words. Reindeer that are perfectly calm and cooperative when they're just standing around become absolute drama queens the moment you approach them with a harness. It's like they've never seen leather straps before, like this isn't something you do 30 times a year, every year, and have been doing since these particular reindeer were born. You approach the first one, a reliable gelding named in your head, usually okay, and he immediately decides that today is the day he explores his acting career by pretending the harness is going to kill him. It takes 10 minutes of patient maneuvering to get usually okay into his harness, which is actually pretty good time. The next reindeer takes 15 minutes. The third one takes 5, because he's genuinely well-trained and doesn't enjoy making drama. The fourth one takes 25 minutes because he's apparently decided that standing still is for other reindeer, and every time you get close with the harness he sidesteps just far enough to be annoying. Your son is working on another group and you can hear him talking to the reindeer in that specific combat firm tone that all good herders develop, the voice that says, "We're doing this whether you like it or not, but we can do it the easy way if you prefer." The harness itself is a work of art. Really. A complicated arrangement of straps that goes over the reindeer's shoulders and back, distributing the pulling force across the strongest muscles while avoiding pressure points that would cause discomfort or injury. There are chest straps, belly bands, crupper straps that go under the tail, which the reindeer especially hate, and multiple connection points where the trace is attached to the sledge. Everything has to be adjusted just right. Too loose and the harness shifts and rubs, too tight and you're causing unnecessary pain and reducing pulling efficiency. You've been doing this for 30 years and you still sometimes get it wrong on the first try, which means unharnessing, adjusting, and harnessing again while the reindeer in question gives you a look that clearly says, "I could have told you that wouldn't work." By the time all 18 reindeer are harnessed and attached to their respective sledges, the sun is making its brief appearance on the southern horizon, Or at least, the sky is getting slightly less dark in that direction, which is close enough to sunrise for government work. Your wife has the last of the essential items packed and is standing next to the stripped chum frame with your daughter on her hip. The chum poles will stay here, you have another set at your destination, and hauling 40 wooden poles across the tundra when you don't need to is nobody's idea of efficiency. These poles will stay here until you return to this area next year, assuming they don't get scattered by wind or taken by another family that needs them, which is just how things work in a sharing economy based on practical necessity rather than formal property rights. You do a final check of each sledge, pulling on straps and ropes, making sure nothing is going to shift or fall off during transit. The loads are substantial. Each sledge is carrying somewhere between 300 and 500 pounds, but they're well distributed and properly secured. The pulling reindeer are standing in their harnesses with that patient, slightly martyred expression that draft animals everywhere seem to develop, like they're tolerating your nonsense but want you to know they're not happy about it. Your wife and daughter will ride on the passenger sledge for at least part of the journey, because while your wife can absolutely walk 40 kilometers if she needs to, doing so while carrying a 4-year-old in this weather is unnecessary suffering when you have alternatives. The main herd is starting to get restless, sensing that something is about to happen. They're moving around more, calling to each other, and the younger animals are doing that thing where they run in small circles for no apparent reason except youthful energy. You need to get moving before they decide to drift off on their own or scatter in multiple directions. The migration route you're following is traditional. Your family has used this route for at least 5 generations, probably longer, but it's not like there's a road or even a clearly marked trail. You navigate by landmarks, that distinctively shaped hill, that frozen stream, that area where the rocks poke through the snow in a recognizable pattern, by the reindeer's own grazing instincts, and by a mental map that's been passed down through generations and refined through experience. Your son takes the lead position, moving ahead of the main herd to show them the direction. You and your wife position yourselves on the flanks, ready to discourage any reindeer that decides to wander off course. The sledges are arranged in a line, each pulled by its team of reindeer, with enough space between them that if one sledge stops suddenly, the others won't crash into it. Everything is ready. You take a deep breath of air so cold it feels like inhaling knives, and then you give the signal to start moving. The sledge reindeer lean into their harnesses. The runners break free from where they've frozen to the ground overnight, and your entire household begins lurching forward across the snow. The main herd follows because that's what reindeer do. They follow movement, they follow their trained lead animals, they follow their instinct to stay with the group. Within 5 minutes, you've got 800 reindeer and 4 loaded sledges moving in roughly the same direction at roughly the same pace, which is about as organized as this ever gets. It's controlled chaos, a moving carpet of animals and supplies that flows across the tundra like some kind of bizarre migration engine. The pace is slow, maybe 3 kilometers per hour, which sounds absurdly slow until you remember that you're doing this for 12 to 14 hours, but it's steady. The reindeer have done this before. The sledge animals know their job. Everyone settles into the rhythm of movement. You walk alongside the herd, watching for problems, encouraging stragglers, keeping the edges tight so nobody drifts too far from the group. The cold is brutal, but you're moving, which means you're generating heat, which means you're not in immediate danger of freezing. Your face is protected by your hood, your hands are in fur mittens, and your layers of reindeer fur are trapping enough body heat that you're actually almost comfortable. Almost. The landscape moves past with glacial slowness, a frozen stream that you cross carefully, testing the ice before committing the sledges, a low hill that requires extra encouragement to get the reindeer climbing, a flat plain that stretches for several kilometers and provides easy travel but zero windbreak. The wind is constant, not strong enough to be dangerous but persistent enough to be annoying, driving tiny ice crystals into any exposed skin and making your eyes water. You navigate by keeping the wind at a consistent angle to your body. Right now it's coming from your left side at about 45 degrees, which means you're heading roughly southeast, which is correct for this section of the route. 2 hours in, one of the sledge reindeer starts limping. Not badly, but enough that you notice it. You call a halt, which takes about 10 minutes because 800 reindeer don't stop instantly. They sort of gradually notice that everyone else is stopping and eventually decide to stop too. You examine the limping reindeer and find a small chunk of ice wedged between his hoof pads, which is painful but easily fixed. You remove the ice, check that there's no actual injury, and decide he can continue pulling. If the limp gets worse, you'll swap him out for one of the backup animals. But for now, he's fine. 3 hours in, your daughter wants down from the sledge because riding is boring and she wants to walk. Your wife lets her down, knowing that she'll last maybe 20 minutes before she wants back up. And sure enough, 15 minutes later you're lifting a tired 4-year-old back onto the passenger sledge where she immediately falls asleep in the nest of furs. Children have that amazing ability to sleep anywhere, completely oblivious to cold, noise, or the fact that they're traveling across the Arctic on a wooden sledge pulled by reindeer. For hours in, you stop for a proper break. The reindeer need rest, they've been pulling for 4 hours straight, and humans need food and warm drinks and a chance to deal with biological necessities that are significantly more complicated when you're wearing 8 layers of clothing in negative 45-degree weather. Your wife gets a fire going using driftwood you brought with you and some kind of accelerant that might be seal oil or might be something else. You've learned not to ask too many questions about your wife's fire-starting methods. The tea is hot and bitter and perfect, and the dried meat you're chewing is tough enough to serve as a jaw workout but provides the calories you desperately need. The herd is scattered across about 100 meters of tundra, some lying down to rest, others pawing through the snow looking for lichen, all of them taking advantage of the break. Your son is checking the sledge reindeer, making sure none of them are developing harness sores or showing signs of excessive fatigue. This is the kind of attention that separates good herders from dead herders. You can't wait until problems become obvious. You have to catch them early when they're still fixable. The break lasts about 45 minutes, long enough to rest but not so long that the reindeer get too comfortable and refuse to start moving again. Then you're up, packing up the fire, checking the sledges one more time, and starting the whole process over. The afternoon portion of the journey is always harder than the morning because everyone's tired. The reindeer are less enthusiastic, and the accumulated small annoyances start adding up to actual frustration. But you keep moving because stopping means camping in the middle of nowhere with no shelter and no lichen for the reindeer, and that's not a real option. 5 hours later, as the brief winter daylight is fading back into twilight, you see your destination. A slight rise in the tundra where you camped 2 years ago, with good lichen coverage and some protection from the prevailing winds. You feel that surge of relief that comes with reaching your goal, and even the reindeer seem to perk up, sensing that the day's travel is nearly over. The last kilometer is always the hardest because everyone wants to rush, but rushing with loaded sledges and tired animals is how accidents happen, so you maintain discipline and keep the pace steady until you're finally at the new campsite. You've traveled 42 kilometers today, slightly more than planned because you had to detour around an area where the ice looked suspicious. You're exhausted, your feet hurt, your face is windburned despite the fur protection, and you need to pee so badly that it's becoming a medical emergency. But you're here. Your herd is intact. Your supplies arrived undamaged. By the standards of tundra migration, today was a complete success. Now you just have to set up camp before it gets fully dark and the temperature drops another 10 degrees. Easy. The first thing you do after arriving at the new campsite, after taking care of that urgent biological need you've been ignoring for the past hour, is assess the lichen situation, because your comfort is negotiable but the herd's food supply absolutely is not. You walk a wide perimeter around the area where you're planning to set up the chum, kicking at the snow with your boot to see what's underneath. The snow here is about 30 centimeters deep, which is actually ideal. Deep enough to protect the lichen from the worst of the wind and cold, shallow enough that the reindeer won't exhaust themselves digging for food. You expose several patches of lichen and you're relieved to see thick, healthy growth in shades of gray-green and pale yellow. This is good grazing, untouched since you were here 2 years ago, and it should support your herd for at least 4 or 5 days before you need to move again. Lichen is one of those organisms that doesn't get nearly enough respect considering it's basically the foundation of Arctic ecology. It's not a plant. It's actually a symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae, which sounds like something from a biology textbook but is actually kind of beautiful when you think about it. 2 completely different organisms working together to survive in conditions where neither could exist alone. Historians still argue whether ancient peoples understood the biological complexity of lichen or simply knew through observation that it was valuable forage, but the practical knowledge has been there for thousands of years. Reindeer can smell lichen through a meter of snow, and they'll dig for it obsessively because it's one of the few food sources available year-round in the Arctic. The reindeer are already starting to dig. using their broad hoofs to scrape away snow in circular patterns, creating crater-like feeding sites that the landscape. You can hear the scraping sound from dozens of animals all working at once, and it's actually sort of soothing, the sound of your herd taking care of itself, doing what reindeer have done for millennia. Your job now is to make sure they don't wander too far while feeding, that they stay in a loose group where you can protect them from predators and keep track of everyone. But for the moment, they're content to dig and eat, and that gives you time to focus on setting up camp. Your wife is already unloading the chum poles from the passenger sledge. You brought 30 poles with you from the last campsite, which is fewer than the full 40 you'd normally use, but enough to create a solid structure. The poles are each about 4 meters long, cut from birch or larch that was harvested far to the south where trees actually grow, then traded northward through networks that connect communities across thousands of kilometers. Each pole is precious because wood is essentially a non-renewable resource out here on the treeless tundra. You treat these poles like gold, repairing them when they crack, replacing them only when absolutely necessary, and never, ever leaving them behind unless you have no choice. Setting up a chum is a 2-person job at minimum, though it goes faster with 3 or 4 helpers. Your son is still with the herd, keeping them from drifting, so it's just you and your wife for now. Your daughter is sitting on a bundle of furs nearby, wrapped in her own miniature militsa, watching with the intense focus that 4-year-olds bring to activities they don't quite understand but find fascinating anyway. You start by driving the first 3 poles into the frozen ground, arranging them in a tripod that will form the structure's foundation. Getting poles to stick in permafrost is harder than it sounds. You can't just shove them in like you're setting up a tent on soft ground. You have to find spots where the ground is slightly softer, or use a metal spike to create pilot holes, or just apply a lot of force and hope for the best. The tripod is the critical part. Get this wrong and your entire chum will be unstable. The poles need to be spaced correctly. Too narrow and the structure is cramped, too wide and it's wobbly, and angled properly. Too vertical and it catches too much wind, too slanted and it doesn't have enough interior height. You've set up hundreds of chums in your life and you can eyeball the correct angles pretty reliably now, but you still check and recheck because an unstable chum in high winds isn't just inconvenient, it's potentially deadly. Once the tripod is solid, you start adding the remaining poles, leaning them against the tripod junction and spreading them out in a rough circle. The poles all meet at the top, creating that distinctive conical shape, with the bottom ends spread in a circle that's about 5 meters in diameter. Your wife is working her way around the structure, adjusting pole positions, making sure everything is evenly spaced and properly seated in the ground. She has an eye for this that you've never quite matched. She can spot a misaligned pole from across the structure and will make you move it even when you think it looks fine. She's usually right, which is annoying but also reassuring because it means your home won't fall down. Once all 30 poles are in place, you step back and assess the framework. It looks good, solid and symmetrical, and you allow yourself a moment of satisfaction before the next phase begins. The hide panels come next, and this is where the work gets really physical. Each panel weighs 25 or 30 pounds, and they're stiff with cold, making them awkward to handle. You and your wife work in coordination that comes from years of practice, lifting panels into place and securing them to the pole framework with leather ties. You start at the bottom and work your way up, overlapping the panels like shingles so water, or in this case, blown snow, runs down and away from the structure rather than seeping inside. The panels are arranged with the door facing east, away from the prevailing winds, and with a careful overlap pattern that prevents drafts while still allowing some air circulation. The smoke hole at the top is left open. You'll cover it with a smaller panel that can be adjusted depending on wind direction and fire intensity, but for now it's just an opening at the apex where all the poles meet. Getting the hide panels to lie flat and tight is an art form. Too loose and they flap in the wind all night, making sleep impossible. Too tight and you risk tearing the hides when they contract further in the cold. Your wife is tying off the last of the panels, making small adjustments to the tension, tucking edges so they overlap properly. This is her domain, really. You're just the muscle here, lifting and holding while she does the skilled work of making everything fit correctly. The interior layout comes next, and this follows a pattern that's been standardized across Nenets culture for generations. The fire pit goes exactly in the center, directly under the smoke hole. The sleeping platforms go along the sides, with the place of honor, the platform furthest from the door and closest to the warmth, reserved for elders or guests. Right now, that's where your daughter will sleep, along with your wife. You and your son will sleep on the platforms flanking the fire, close enough to tend it during the night, but not so close that you'll roast. The area near the door is for storage and boots and all the wet, dirty stuff that shouldn't be in the main living space. You start hauling supplies inside, first the sleeping furs, then the cooking equipment, then the food stores, then everything else in a prioritized order that your wife dictates. She's directing traffic from inside the chum, pointing to where things should go, occasionally emerging to grab something specific that she needs right now. The interior is dark and cold at first, just a hollow space defined by poles and hides, but as you add possessions it starts to feel like a home. The sleeping furs make it cozy. The cooking equipment makes it functional. The small carved figures of ancestral spirits that your wife places near the sleeping platforms make it sacred. This transformation always feels slightly magical to you, the way an empty structure becomes a lived-in space just by adding the accumulated stuff of daily life. The fire is the last and most important step. Your wife has been preparing it while you hauled supplies, building a careful arrangement of kindling in the fire pit. She's using birch bark as tinder, collected and saved from the last time you were near trees months ago, and building up from there to small twigs, then larger pieces of driftwood. Fire making in the Arctic is its own skill set. The wood is often damp or frozen, the air is so cold that flames don't want to spread, and you're working with limited fuel that needs to last for days or weeks. Your wife strikes sparks from flint and steel, catching them in a handful of dried grass, blowing gently to encourage a flame. This takes longer in the cold, and you can see her breath creating condensation around the nascent fire, which doesn't help matters. Finally, a flame catches. She nurses it carefully, feeding it the smallest pieces of kindling, letting it build strength before adding anything substantial. The smoke rises toward the smoke hole, and most of it actually makes it out rather than filling the chum, which means you set up the structure correctly and the draft is working as intended. As the fire grows, the temperature inside the chum starts to rise, slowly at first, then more noticeably. You can feel the difference even through all your layers. The air goes from painfully cold to almost comfortable over the course of 30 minutes. Your son comes in from checking the herd, and his presence brings a blast of cold air that temporarily undoes all the warming progress. He reports that the herd is scattered but settled, feeding contentedly and showing no signs of distress or danger. This is good news. A calm herd means you can focus on domestic tasks without worrying that 800 reindeer are about to wander off into the darkness. He sheds his outer layers near the door, hanging his sovak on one of the poles and removing his boots so he doesn't track snow throughout the interior. His face is wind-burned and his eyelashes are crusted with frost. But he's grinning because he's a teenager and teenagers think suffering builds character. Your wife is heating water for tea, melting snow in a large pot that sits at the edge of the fire. Making water from snow is inefficient. You need about 10 liters of snow to get 1 liter of water, but it's the only option when you're this far from any liquid water source. The rivers and streams are frozen solid, and even if you could chop through the ice, hauling water back to camp would be a nightmare. So you melt snow patiently, constantly, producing water for drinking, cooking, and washing in volumes that barely meet your minimum needs. You drink more tea than water out here because tea at least has flavor and provides some calories from the fat and sometimes sugar you add to it. Dinner preparation begins while you're still warming up. Your wife is unpacking dried meat, fish that was smoked and dried last summer, some kind of root vegetable that you're not entirely sure the name of but that stores well in cold weather. She's also got flour for making bread and some kind of dried berries that will go into a soup or stew. Nenet's cuisine isn't complicated. It doesn't need to be when you're working with limited ingredients and limited fuel, but it's surprisingly satisfying when you're cold and tired and have burned thousands of calories just existing in this environment. The fundamental food group here is reindeer. Reindeer meat, reindeer fat, reindeer organs, reindeer blood, reindeer bone marrow. Everything gets used because wasting food is not just impractical, it's basically immoral when you're living this close to the edge of survival. Your daughter has fallen asleep on the sleeping platform, exhausted from the day's travel despite having ridden on a sledge for most of it. Just being outside in the cold is tiring, and being 4 years old is already exhausting under the best circumstances. Your wife covers her with an extra fur and lets her sleep through dinner preparation. She'll wake up when the food is ready, drawn by the smell and the warmth and the knowledge that her stomach needs filling. The chum is fully warm now, almost comfortable, and you can finally remove some of your layers without risking hypothermia. You strip down to just your inner militia, and the relief of having fewer pounds of fur on your body is profound. Your wife has made tea, and you wrap your hands around the cup, feeling the warmth seep into your fingers. Your son is doing the same, both of you just sitting for a moment, recovering from the day's exertion. Tomorrow you'll start the daily routine again, checking the herd, maintaining equipment, preparing for the next move. But for right now, in this moment, you're warm and safe and fed, and that's enough. Outside, you can hear the wind picking up, but inside the chum the fire is crackling and the walls are solid and your family is together. This is what success looks like on the tundra. Not wealth or comfort or luxury, but basic survival made slightly easier by preparation and skill. You're 42 kilometers from where you started this morning, you'll be somewhere else in 4 days, and you'll keep moving like this through the winter and into spring and through summer and back to winter again, following the reindeer, following the lichen, following patterns that your ancestors established and that you're maintaining for one more year, one more generation. The afternoon settles into that particular rhythm that exists only in established camps. Purposeful but not frantic, everyone attending to tasks that need doing without the pressure of immediate survival concerns. You've eaten lunch, the chum is warm, and the herd is contentedly grazing about 200 meters from camp, close enough to monitor but far enough that they're not trampling everything or investigating your supplies with their persistently curious noses. This is the time for maintenance, for addressing all those small problems that accumulate during daily life but get ignored during the chaos of moving or immediate crises. Your mental to-do list is substantial. Several reindeer need medical attention, harness leather needs repair, your boots have developed a worrying squeak that might indicate structural failure, and someone needs to check the herd's overall health more systematically than the quick morning count allows. You start with the reindeer that have been concerning you. The young female with the nasal discharge is first priority. Respiratory infections can spread through a herd with terrifying speed, and early intervention is the difference between one sick animal and 50 dead ones. You trudge out into the cold, which feels even more brutal after the warmth of the chum, and locate her grazing with a small group of other females. She's still showing discharge, maybe slightly worse than this morning, but she's eating normally and her breathing sounds clear. You stand there for 5 minutes just watching her breathe, looking for any signs of labored respiration, listening for rattling or wheezing. She sounds fine, which is good news, but the discharge bothers you. Your medical options are limited. You don't have antibiotics, those exist in the world, theoretically, probably in the hospital in Sailcard about 300 kilometers southwest of here. But they're not accessible to you at this moment in any practical sense. What you have is traditional knowledge passed down through generations, plant medicines collected during the brief summer months, and the option of culling if an animal is too sick to save. For respiratory issues, your grandmother taught you to use a particular type of lichen mixed with reindeer fat, applied to the nostrils and fed in small amounts. Whether this actually has medicinal properties or is just placebo is something historians still argue about. Some ethnobotanists claim certain Arctic lichens have antimicrobial compounds. Others say traditional medicines work primarily through the placebo effect and good animal husbandry practices. You head back to the chum to retrieve your medicine kit, which is really just a leather bag containing various dried plants, some clay containers of mysterious substances, and several items that you inherited from your father without entirely understanding what they're for. Your wife knows more about medicine than you do. Women in Nenet's culture are traditionally the primary healers, and she helps you prepare the lichen mixture, grinding dried lichen between 2 stones and mixing it with rendered fat until it forms a paste. The whole process takes about 20 minutes, and the resulting substance looks disgusting and smells worse, but that's traditional medicine for you. Getting the medicine into the reindeer is the hard part. She's semi-tame but not exactly cooperative, and she has strong opinions about strangers approaching her face with handfuls of weird-smelling paste. You end up recruiting your son to help corner her, not violently, just persuasively, while you smear some of the paste around her nostrils and manage to get a small amount actually into her mouth. She's deeply offended by this entire process and makes her feelings known through a series of snorts and attempts to head, but the medicine is administered, and that's what matters. You'll check her again tomorrow and see if there's improvement. If not, you'll have to make harder decisions about isolation or culling. Next is the male with the cracked hoof from yesterday. You find him lying down at the edge of the herd, and the fact that he's resting by himself rather than with the group is mildly concerning. You examine his hoof again, and the crack looks about the same as yesterday, not better, not obviously worse. The trim job you did yesterday seems to be holding, and there's no sign of infection, which is the main thing you were worried about. Still, you decide to apply some of the reindeer fat salve that you use for various skin and hoof issues. It's probably not doing much beyond keeping moisture out of the crack, but that's actually valuable. Infection in a hoof crack can lead to abscess, and an abscessed hoof means a reindeer that can't walk, which means a dead reindeer because you can't carry a 300-pound animal across the tundra. While you're out examining individuals, you do a more thorough health assessment of the broader herd. This is less about counting and more about observing, watching how animals move, checking their body condition, looking for signs of parasites or illness or injury that might not be immediately obvious during the quick morning checks. Reindeer, like most prey animals, are very good at hiding illness because showing weakness in the wild gets you killed by predators. This means you need to be alert to subtle signs. A slight change in gait, an animal that's not grooming itself properly, someone who's positioned oddly in the social hierarchy. You spot one of the yearlings with what looks like the beginnings of a warble fly infection. Small lumps under the skin on his back where fly larvae have burrowed in and are developing. Warble flies are a fact of life for reindeer herders. These horrifying insects that lay eggs on reindeer during the summer, and the larvae burrow under the skin and live there for months before emerging. They're disgusting, they damage the hide, which reduces its value, and they're painful for the reindeer, but they're rarely fatal. Treatment involves either squeezing the larvae out when they're close to the surface, which is exactly as gross as it sounds, or just waiting for them to emerge naturally. These larvae aren't ready for removal yet. They're still too deep, so you make a mental note to check this yearling again in a few weeks. The bulls are looking good, recovered from the exhaustion of rutting season and starting to put weight back on. Bad Decision, your least favorite bull, is still being antisocial but doesn't show any signs of actual illness. Some bulls are just jerks, and Bad Decision has apparently decided that's his personality. The females are in generally good condition, some starting to show the early signs of pregnancy from fall breeding. Pregnant females need to maintain good body condition through the winter or they'll abort the fetus or give birth to weak calves that won't survive. This is why the quality of winter grazing is so critical. You're not just feeding current animals, you're feeding next year's herd. You find 3 animals with minor injuries that need attention. One with a small cut on her leg, probably from scraping against ice. One with a torn ear that's healing but should be cleaned. And one with what looks like the early stages of frostbite on his tail. The cut gets cleaned with snow. Scrubbing wounds with snow sounds brutal, but it's actually an effective way to remove dirt and bacteria, and then treated with a bit of that all-purpose reindeer fat salve. The torn ear just needs checking to make sure it's not infected. The frostbitten tail is concerning because tails are important for balance and fly swatting in summer, but there's not much you can do about frostbite except hope it doesn't get worse. While you're working through the herd, you notice something that makes you pause. Tracks in the snow, too large to be from foxes, too canine to be from anything friendly. Wolf tracks, probably from last night or early this morning, circling the herd at a distance, testing your defenses. You follow the tracks for about 50 meters, they come from the north, circle around to the west, then head south away from the herd. The wolf was alone, which is good because lone wolves are usually just scouting, looking for easy opportunities. Pack hunts are coordinated attacks on vulnerable targets, and those are genuinely dangerous to your herd. You head back to camp to report the wolf sign to your son, who will need to be extra vigilant tonight during his watch shifts. Wolves are smart enough to test your routines, to watch for patterns, to strike when attention is divided or when weather conditions favor them. Your presence and the presence of your dogs, actually, you don't have dogs this year, one of yours died last spring and the other is getting too old for the hard work of herding, which is a whole separate problem you need to address, is usually enough to keep wolves at a respectful distance, but usually isn't always, and complacency kills reindeer. Back at the chum, your wife has been working on leather repair, the pile of worn harness pieces you set aside yesterday. She's sitting cross-legged near the fire, needle and sinew in hand, making tiny precise stitches that reinforce stress points and repair cracks before they become tears. Watching her work is oddly hypnotic. The rhythmic pull of thread through leather, the way her hands move with practiced efficiency, the growing pile of repaired pieces beside her. She's been sewing leather since she was 6 years old, and she's frighteningly good at it. Some of her repairs are stronger than the original construction, her stitching so tight and even that it looks almost machine-made. Your daughter is awake now, playing with a set of carved reindeer figurines that your father made years ago. She's creating some kind of elaborate game that involves the reindeer figurines having conversations and apparently going on adventures, complete with sound effects and dramatic narration. Children in nomadic cultures grow up playing with toys that reflect their daily reality. Miniature chums, carved animals, small sledges, and through play they learn the skills and knowledge they'll need as adults. Your daughter's game involves one reindeer getting lost and the others having to find it, which is honestly a pretty realistic scenario for actual reindeer herding. Your son comes in from his herd check, stamping snow off his boots and reporting that everything looks calm. You tell him about the wolf tracks, and his expression shifts from casual to alert in an instant. Wolf awareness is something you learn young if you're a herder, not paranoia exactly, but a constant low-level readiness to respond to threats. You discuss the watch schedule for tonight. Normally you might sleep straight through, trusting the reindeer to alert you if something approaches, but with wolf sign this fresh you'll do formal watches. 2 hours on, 4 hours off, rotating through the night. The afternoon continues its slow progression toward evening. You work on your boots, the squeaky ones that have been bothering you. The problem turns out to be a loose seam where the sole attaches to the upper, easily fixed with some additional stitching and a bit of waterproof sealant made from pine pitch that you've been hoarding since last summer. Your wife critiques your stitching, not harshly but honestly, pointing out where you're being sloppy, and you redo the section she flags. Marriage to a master craftswoman means your own skills get constantly evaluated and corrected, which is annoying but also means your boots don't fall apart at inconvenient moments. Your son is sharpening knives, running whetstones along blades that have dulled from constant use. Knives are tools, weapons, and survival equipment all in one, and keeping them sharp is a daily maintenance task. He's using a specific two-stone technique that his grandfather taught him: coarse stone for major sharpening, fine stone for honing the edge, and the rhythmic scraping sound fills the chum. You watch him work and notice that his technique has improved significantly from last year. His edges are more consistent, his angle control is better, and he's not taking off more metal than necessary. The light outside is fading now, that early sunset that comes in December when you're this far north. The sun made its brief appearance and is already giving up, leaving you with that long blue twilight that will gradually deepen into night. The temperature is dropping again, you can feel it even inside the chum, as if the cold is pressing against the hide walls, looking for entry points. Your wife is preparing dinner, a stew made from dried reindeer meat, some kind of root vegetables, and water flavored with wild herbs. It's not fancy, but after a day in the cold it smells like the best thing you've ever encountered. The herd is settling for the evening, lying down in groups, their collective body heat creating small clouds of steam that hang in the still air. They're calm, which means you can be relatively calm, though you'll still maintain those watches tonight because of the wolf sign. You eat dinner sitting around the fire, passing bowls of stew, soaking bread in the broth, feeling the hot food warm you from the inside out. Your daughter eats like a tiny ravenous animal, which is how 4-year-olds always eat, without restraint or dignity. Your son eats with teenage efficiency, consuming vast quantities and looking around for more. After dinner, as the darkness settles completely outside, you sit by the fire and feel the accumulated fatigue of the day settling into your bones. You've walked several kilometers, treated sick animals, repaired equipment, moved camp, and done 100 other small tasks that don't seem like much individually, but that add up to a full day's hard work. Tomorrow you'll do it again, and the day after that. This is your life. Not exciting, not particularly comfortable, but sustainable in its rhythms, connected to patterns that go back thousands of years. You're a link in a chain that stretches from your ancestors to your descendants, maintaining knowledge and skills that keep your people alive in one of Earth's harshest environments. It's not much, perhaps, but it's something. It's enough. The evening light, what little there was of it, has faded completely now, and you're facing the practical challenge of setting up a proper camp for what you hope will be at least a 4 or 5 day stay. The chum is up and warm, which is the critical foundation, but there's still substantial work to be done before you can consider the camp truly established. The fire needs a proper fuel supply organized and protected from snow. The sleeping areas need to be arranged not just for tonight but for extended occupation. The surrounding area needs to be organized so that necessary items are accessible and everything has its place. Disorder in camp leads to wasted time and energy, and wasted time and energy leads to mistakes, and mistakes in the Arctic lead to people dying. So you're meticulous about this, even when you're tired, even when the cold is making your fingers clumsy and your brain sluggish. First priority is firewood. You brought a supply with you on the sledges. Driftwood collected from a riverbank weeks ago, dried and stored and carefully rationed. But it needs to be unloaded and organized where it will stay accessible but won't get buried by snow if the weather turns. You and your son haul the wood from the sledges to a spot about 3 meters from the chum entrance, close enough to be convenient but far enough that sparks from the fire won't reach it. You stack it in a specific pattern that your father taught you. Larger pieces on the bottom for stability, medium pieces in the middle for easy access, smallest pieces on top for kindling. The whole pile gets covered with a reindeer hide weighted down with rocks to keep it from blowing away but still allowing air circulation so the wood doesn't get damp. Your wife is inside arranging the sleeping platforms with obsessive precision. The furs need to be layered in a specific order, the densest, warmest ones on bottom for insulation from the frozen ground, medium-weight furs in the middle for cushioning, and the softest, newest furs on top where they'll be in contact with skin. She's also arranging the personal sleeping spaces so that each family member has their designated area with their specific belongings. Your daughter's spot has her carved animals and her small collection of colored stones. Your son's area has his knife maintenance tools and the beginning of what will probably become a rope braiding project. Your space has your own tools, a half-finished carving that you've been working on for months, and the small leather pouch containing items that belong to your father and grandfather. The storage areas need organizing too. Food supplies go on the side of the chum that stays coldest. You're essentially using the chum's interior temperature gradient as a refrigerator, with the warmest spots near the fire and the coldest spots near the walls. Dried meat and fish go in leather bags hung from the poles where they're accessible but protected from rodents, though honestly rodents are not a major concern in December on the tundra. Fresh meat, you slaughtered one of the weaker males 2 days ago and have been carrying sections of him with you, goes in a wooden box that stays on the cold side. Flour and other dry goods go in sealed containers, because moisture is the enemy of food preservation even in freezing temperatures. The cooking equipment gets its own designated area near the fire, but not so close that soot and ash contaminate everything. Your wife has specific ideas about how pots and pans should be arranged, and you've learned through 16 years of marriage not to question her organizational system even when it seems unnecessarily complicated. There are large pots for melting snow and boiling water, medium pots for cooking stew, small pots for making tea, and various utensils that all have their proper places. She's also got a collection of wooden bowls, horn spoons, and a few metal implements that came from Russian traders decades ago and have been passed through the family. Your son is working on the sledges, unloading the remaining supplies and then securing the sledges themselves so they won't blow away or get damaged. Empty sledges are surprisingly vulnerable to wind. They're light enough that a strong gust can flip them or send them tumbling across the tundra. So he's weighing them down with rocks and tying them to stakes driven into the frozen ground. He's also checking the runners for damage, examining the antler shoes that protect the wooden runners from wear. One of the antler sections has a crack that will need replacement soon, but it's holding for now, and replacement antler is not something you have readily available, so it becomes one more item on the mental list of problems that need addressing eventually. The area around the chum needs to be organized into functional zones. There's a designated toilet area about 50 meters downwind. You mark it with a pole stuck in the snow so everyone knows where it is even in darkness or during snowstorms. There's a designated area for butchering and processing reindeer, far enough from the chum that blood and offal won't attract scavengers to your living space, but close enough that you're not hauling carcasses across the tundra. There's the wood storage area you already set up. And there's a small area near the chum entrance for boots and outer garments. A transitional space between inside and outside where you can remove wet or snowy items before bringing them into the main living area. The herd needs boundaries too, even though they're not physical boundaries. You walk the perimeter of where you want the reindeer to stay, planting occasional markers, just sticks or piles of stones, that serve more as mental landmarks for you than actual barriers. The reindeer will drift and wander, as reindeer do, but having a mental map of their expected range helps you notice more quickly when someone has wandered too far, or when the herd is drifting in a direction you don't want. You also note landmarks in the surrounding area. That distinctively shaped boulder about 200 meters north, that slight depression in the ground to the east, that patch of exposed rock to the south. These become reference points for navigation and for describing locations to your family members. While you're walking the perimeter, you notice more wolf tracks, a different set from the ones you found earlier. These are heading east, possibly from the same wolf making another circuit or possibly from a different wolf entirely. The tracks are several hours old. The edges have already hardened and the snow inside the prints has that crystalline texture that develops over time, but their presence is a reminder that you're being watched. Wolves don't see reindeer herds as threats. They see them as mobile buffets that they can't quite access because of the annoying humans who keep interfering. Your existence here is basically a constant low-level conflict with predators who would very much like to eat your livelihood. Back at the Chum, your wife has finished organizing the interior and is now working on setting up the small altar area where she keeps sacred objects and makes offerings to ensure the family's safety and the herd's health. This is a combination of shamanic practice and practical folk tradition, blended together in ways that would probably make anthropologists argue about categories and definitions. She's arranged small carved figures, ancestors, spirits, representations of protective forces, on a small platform, along with a few precious items that have been in her family for generations. She lights a small amount of dried herbs, letting the smoke drift around the altar space, and mutters prayers or requests or possibly just reminders to the spirits that you're here and would appreciate their cooperation. The religious and spiritual life of Nenet's herders is complex and doesn't map neatly onto Western categories. There are elements of shamanism, animism, ancestor worship, and what you might call practical magic, rituals performed not necessarily because you believe they work in a supernatural sense, but because they're part of the cultural pattern that has sustained your people, and maintaining that pattern feels important. Historians still argue whether pre-Soviet Nenets religion was primarily shamanistic or had more complex theological structures that were lost during Soviet suppression of indigenous practices. What survived is this hybrid, part traditional practice, part improvisation, part personal interpretation. Your daughter is fascinated by the altar and wants to help, which your wife allows with careful supervision. She lets your daughter place one of the small offerings, a piece of dried fish, while explaining in simplified terms why they do this. "We thank the spirits for protecting us today," your wife says. "We ask them to keep protecting us tomorrow." Your daughter nods seriously, as if she understands the full theological implications, which she absolutely doesn't, but that's fine. Religious education happens through participation and repetition, through doing things alongside adults until they become internalized patterns. The wind is picking up outside, not dangerously but noticeably, and you can hear it testing the Chum walls, pressing against the hide panels, looking for weak spots. The structure holds firm. You built it well, the panels are tight, the poles are solid, and the wind noise becomes just background, like living next to the ocean and learning to tune out the sound of waves. Inside the Chum, the temperature has stabilized at something almost comfortable, maybe 10 or 15 degrees above freezing near the fire, dropping to below freezing near the walls. This temperature gradient is normal and expected. You deal with it by wearing layers and moving closer to or farther from the fire depending on whether you're too cold or too hot. Your son is repairing his rope, the coil he made and is already damaged from today's use. One of the sledge reindeer stepped on it during harnessing, and the pressure created a weak spot that needs reinforcing. He's adding additional strands of sinew, braiding them into the existing rope, strengthening the damaged section. This is normal maintenance. Nothing lasts forever out here, everything degrades, and survival depends on constant repair and renewal. You never throw anything away unless it's literally unusable, and even then you salvage whatever parts can be salvaged. That damaged rope section will get cut out once it's too weak to trust, but the remaining sections will get repurposed for something else. You're working on your own project, a new knife handle to replace one that cracked last week. You're carving it from a piece of antler, shaping it to fit your hand, creating a grip that will work even when your hands are cold and clumsy. Antler is good for this because it's strong, relatively lightweight, and has a natural texture that provides grip. You're using your current knife to carve the new handle, which creates an interesting paradox. You need the knife to make the handle, but you need the handle to make the knife properly functional. You work slowly, checking the fit frequently, removing small amounts of material at a time. Your father taught you that it's always easier to remove more material than to add material back, so you err on the side of caution. The carving is meditative, repetitive work that allows your mind to wander while your hands stay busy. You think about the herd's health, about the wolf tracks, about whether the lichen here will last as long as you need it to. You think about your son and whether he'll stay with this life or whether the pull of towns and wage labor will eventually draw him away. You think about your daughter and what kind of world she'll grow up into, whether there will still be nomadic herding in 20 years, whether climate change and industrial development will make this lifestyle impossible. These are heavy thoughts for knife handle carving, but they're the thoughts that occupy herders in the long winter darkness. Your wife is preparing a late evening snack. Not a full meal, just something warm to drink and maybe a piece of bread to settle stomachs before sleep. She's melting snow for tea, the familiar sound of water beginning to bubble in the pot. The tea is strong and bitter, mixed with reindeer fat and a small amount of precious sugar that you traded for months ago. Sugar is a luxury out here, something you use sparingly, measuring it out in tiny amounts that nonetheless transform bitter tea into something almost pleasant. The family gathers around the fire for tea, sitting in comfortable silence. There's not much conversation at this hour. Everyone is tired, and words feel like effort. Your daughter is already drowsy, leaning against your wife's shoulder, her eyes half closed. Your son is staring into the fire with that unfocused gaze that means he's not really seeing anything, just letting his mind rest. You sip your tea and feel the warmth spread through your chest, and for a moment everything feels stable and secure. The walls are solid. The fire is warm. The herd is calm outside. Your family is together and safe. This moment won't last. Moments like this never do, but you can appreciate it while it's here. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, new problems that need solving, new decisions that need making. But that's tomorrow's concern. Tonight, you've done what needed doing. The camp is established, the herd is safe, and your family has shelter and warmth. By the standards of life on the tundra, this counts as success. You finish your tea, add another piece of wood to the fire, and start the process of preparing for sleep, knowing that in a few hours you'll be up again for your watch shift, checking on the herd, listening for wolves, maintaining the eternal vigilance that keeps everyone alive. But for now, just for now, you can rest. The darkness outside is complete now, that profound Arctic darkness that comes when there's no moon, no artificial light, and the sun is so far below the horizon that it might as well not exist. Inside the chum, the firelight creates a small bubble of warmth and visibility, flickering shadows dancing across the hide walls, and this becomes your entire world for the evening hours. Your daughter has been put to bed, buried under furs in her sleeping area, already unconscious with that absolute commitment to sleep that small children possess. Your wife is working by lamplight, not a modern lamp, but a traditional seal oil lamp that provides a small, steady flame and smells vaguely of marine mammal, doing the detailed work that requires better light than the fire alone provides. She's working on your mukluks, the boots that have been serving you faithfully but are starting to show serious wear. The embroidery around the tops is coming loose, victim of constant friction and temperature extremes, and several of the decorative elements need to be restitched before they're lost entirely. But this isn't just about decoration. Though the patterns are beautiful and represent specific family and regional traditions, it's also structural. The embroidery helps reinforce seams, provides additional waterproofing, and marks these boots as belonging to you specifically, part of your identity in a culture where individual ownership and family connection are literally stitched into your clothing. Your wife's stitching is precise and methodical, each stitch placed exactly where it needs to be, the sinew thread pulled tight but not so tight that it puckers the leather. She's recreating patterns that her mother taught her, geometric designs that have meanings you only partially understand. Something about protective symbols, family lineage, and aesthetic preferences all encoded in the arrangement of lines and curves. Nenet's clothing is a form of information storage, carrying data about family connections, regional origins, and social status in patterns that are readable to those who know the language. An experienced person can look at someone's clothing and tell you approximately where they're from, which family group they belong to, and sometimes even identify specific individuals by their unique pattern variations. You're working on your own repair project, fixing a tear in your inner militia that you've been ignoring for 2 weeks. The tear is in an awkward spot under the arm, where the hide flexes constantly during movement, and it's been gradually expanding from a small split to a hole that's starting to compromise the garment's insulation properties. You're not as skilled at sewing as your wife, not even close, but you can handle basic repairs with adequate competence. You're using a curved needle, threading it with sinew that you've softened by running it through your teeth, working in the awkward light and trying not to stab yourself in the process. Your son is doing something that looks like homework, though that's not quite the right term. He's working with maps, not government maps or GPS coordinates, but traditional knowledge maps that exist primarily in memory and oral tradition but that he's trying to document in drawings. He's sketching the migration route, marking landmarks, noting distances and seasonal variations, creating a physical record of knowledge that's normally transmitted through storytelling and direct experience. This is a complicated practice in Nenet's culture. There's some resistance to writing things down because it can seem like admitting that the oral traditions aren't sufficient. But there's also recognition that the world is changing and having written records might help preserve knowledge for future generations. His maps are rough but recognizable, showing rivers, hills, traditional camping spots, and grazing areas. He's marking them with both Russian words. He's had some formal education, more than you had at his age, and with traditional descriptive terms that don't translate neatly. The place where the rocks look like sleeping bears becomes a specific location on the map, as does the river crossing where grandfather's sledge broke through the ice, and the hill where we saw the white reindeer. These aren't official place names, but they're the names that matter to your family, the names that carry stories and meaning and practical navigation information. You watch him work and feel that complicated mix of emotions that parents feel when they see their children doing things differently than they did. Pride, because he's taking initiative and thinking about the future. Anxiety, because writing things down changes them somehow, makes them fixed and permanent when they should be fluid and adaptable. Curiosity about whether his children will still know these places, whether the maps he's making will still be relevant in 30 or 40 years, or whether oil development and climate change will transform the landscape into something unrecognizable. The conversation is sparse, everyone focused on their individual tasks, but there's a companionable quality to the silence. This is family time in a nomadic herding culture. Not sitting around actively engaging in leisure activities, but working together in the same space, maintaining the equipment and knowledge that keeps everyone alive. Your wife occasionally asks you to hold something while she stitches. Your son occasionally asks for clarification about a landmark or distance. You occasionally grunt in response, because extensive verbal communication feels like too much effort after a long day. Outside, you can hear the herd settling for the night, the sounds gradually decreasing as more reindeer lie down and stop moving around. They cluster together for warmth, creating pockets of body heat that help them survive the night. The clicking sound of their tendons is still audible but less frequent, and the general acoustic picture is one of calm. This is good. A restless herd would indicate that something was wrong. Predators nearby, insufficient food, illness spreading through the group, or just the kind of general anxiety that reindeer sometimes develop for no clear reason. You finish the repair on your militia and try it on to make sure the stitching is holding properly and the tear isn't pulling in weird ways. Feels fine, slightly stiff where you've reinforced it but functional. Your wife inspects your work with a critical eye and makes a non-committal sound that might be approval or might be resigned acceptance that this is the best you're capable of. She doesn't redo your stitching, which is her way of saying it's adequate. High praise, really, coming from someone who can sew leather blindfolded. The lamp is starting to run low on oil, the flame getting smaller and less steady. Your wife adds a small amount of precious fuel. The seal oil was traded from coastal Nenets families who have access to marine resources, and the flame stabilizes again. Light is a limited resource out here, as valuable in its way as food or shelter. The fire provides some illumination, but for detailed work you need something more focused, and fuel for lamps is expensive in terms of either money or trade goods. You use it sparingly only for tasks that genuinely require good lighting, rationing it the way you ration everything else. Stories start happening naturally around this time of evening, Traditional tales that get told and retold with variations, serving as entertainment, education, and cultural preservation all at once. Your wife begins one about a herder who ignored warnings about thin ice and lost half his herd, a cautionary tale with practical safety lessons embedded in the narrative. Your son has heard this story dozens of times but listens anyway, because that's how oral tradition works. Repetition, memorization, internalization until the stories become part of your cognitive furniture. You contribute a story your grandfather told you about a particularly clever wolverine that raided camps up and down the peninsula for an entire winter, evading every trap and defense, until a young girl figured out its pattern and finally caught it. The story is probably mostly fictional. The wolverine's exploits become more elaborate with each telling, but it contains real information about wolverine behavior, trap construction, and the importance of observation and pattern recognition. Your daughter is supposedly asleep, but you can see her eyes glinting in the darkness, listening despite being supposedly unconscious. These stories serve multiple functions beyond entertainment. They're how knowledge gets transmitted across generations without writing. They're how ethical and practical lessons get taught without formal instruction. They're how community identity gets maintained across families and regions. Everyone knows the same core stories, though details and interpretations vary. And they're how historical information gets preserved, though historians still argue about how to separate literal historical fact from metaphorical or mythological elements in oral traditions. Your son asks about one of the stories from his great-grandfather's time, something about a winter so cold that reindeer antlers were shattering from frost. You tell him what you remember, though you're not sure if this is literal truth, exaggeration, or metaphor for extremely harsh conditions. The problem with oral history is that every retelling changes it slightly, details get added or lost, and after a few generations it becomes impossible to know what actually happened versus what people believe happened. But maybe that distinction isn't as important as you'd think. The story's function is to communicate winters can be extremely dangerous, and it does that effectively regardless of whether antlers literally shattered. The conversation drifts to more immediate concerns: the wolf tracks, the sick reindeer, the decision about when to move camp next. Your wife thinks 4 days is sufficient grazing here. You're inclined to stay 5 if the wolves don't become more aggressive. Your son points out that staying longer risks overgrazing and damaging the lichen for future years. This is good thinking, the kind of long-term environmental management that sustainable herding requires. You're not just exploiting the landscape, you're maintaining it for your children and grandchildren. The tragedy of the commons doesn't happen in Nenet's culture because the commons aren't treated as infinite. They're recognized as fragile resources that require careful management. You discuss the route for the next move, whether to go directly to the next planned campsite or take a slightly longer route that avoids an area where the ice is supposedly unstable this year. Your wife argues for the longer route, citing reports from another family that passed through 2 weeks ago. Your son wants the direct route because it's more efficient. You're inclined toward your wife's caution because unstable ice and loaded sledges is a combination that has killed people, and efficiency doesn't mean much if you're dead. These discussions are how collective decisions get made in nomadic families, not through formal voting or hierarchical decree, but through conversation where everyone's input is considered and consensus gradually emerges. Your opinion carries weight because you're the household head and you have experience. Your wife's opinion carries weight because she's also experienced and because she's often right about safety concerns. Your son's opinion carries less weight because he's young, but his perspective is still valued and will influence the final decision. By the time the conversation ends, you've agreed on the longer, safer route without anyone explicitly declaring victory or defeat. The fire is burning lower now, and you add another piece of wood, not a large piece because you want the fire to last through the night but not burn too hot, and adjust the logs to ensure good airflow. Fire management is its own skill set, balancing heat output with fuel conservation, managing smoke production, maintaining coals that can be easily revived if the fire dies down too much. A fire that goes completely out in the middle of the night means starting from scratch in the cold darkness, which is miserable. A fire that burns too hot wastes wood and makes the chum uncomfortable. The ideal is a steady, moderate burn that provides consistent heat without requiring constant attention. Your wife finishes her stitching and inspects the mucklucks one final time, checking her work in the lamplight. Satisfied, she sets them aside and begins preparing for bed, banking the fire, arranging the sleeping furs, making sure everything is secure for the night. Your son puts away his maps, storing them carefully in a leather case that protects them from moisture. You do a final check of the door covering, making sure it's properly secured against drafts, but still allows enough air circulation that you won't suffocate overnight. Carbon monoxide from the fire is a real danger in sealed tents, and proper ventilation is the difference between waking up in the morning and not waking up at all. The chum is settling into night mode, the activity winding down, everyone preparing for sleep. You'll take the first watch in a few hours. Someone needs to check the herd periodically through the night, especially with wolf sign this fresh, but for now you can rest. You arrange yourself on your sleeping platform, layers of fur above and below, and feel the accumulated fatigue of the day settling into your bones. The wind outside has died down, and the night is quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional sound from the herd. This is peace such as it exists on the tundra. Not the absence of danger, but the temporary management of it. You close your eyes and drift towards sleep, knowing that in a few hours you'll be up again, continuing the endless cycle of vigilance that keeps your family and herd alive. Sleep comes in fragments on watch nights, shallow and easily broken, your consciousness hovering somewhere between rest and wakefulness. You're aware of the fire's warmth on your face, the weight of furs on your body, the sound of your wife's breathing nearby, but you're also tracking the sounds from outside wind patterns, herd movements, anything that seems wrong or unusual. This is a skill you've developed over decades, the ability to sleep while remaining alert to danger, and it's exhausting in ways that are difficult to explain to people who've never needed to do it. Your body rests, but your mind never fully disengages, always processing information, always ready to wake completely if something requires attention. Your son shakes you awake for the first watch, and you surface from sleep with that instant alertness that comes from years of practice. No grogginess, no slow return to consciousness. You're just awake, oriented, and processing information. The fire has burned down to coals but is still providing heat. Your family is asleep. The wind outside sounds normal. You pull on your boots, they're still slightly warm from being near the fire, and add your outer layers, transforming from sleeping person to functional herder in about 90 seconds. Outside, the cold hits you with familiar brutality. The temperature has dropped further overnight, probably down to -50 now, and the air is so cold it feels solid, like walking into a wall. Your first breath freezes your nose hairs instantly, and you instinctively adjust your breathing to come in through your mouth and nose simultaneously, warming the air slightly before it hits your lungs. The sky is extraordinary. Stars so dense they look like clouds, the Milky Way visible as a luminous band across the heavens, and the aurora dancing in sheets of green and purple light that ripple and flow like cosmic curtains. The aurora is beautiful, genuinely breathtaking, but you barely notice it because you've seen it thousands of times and right now you're focused on the herd. They're clustered in several groups across the snow, dark shapes against darkness, most of them lying down but some still standing and moving slowly. You count by groups, estimating numbers, about 200 in the nearest cluster, maybe 300 in the middle group, the rest scattered in smaller groups further out. The math is approximate but close enough to tell you that nobody has wandered off or been taken during the evening hours. You walk the perimeter slowly, your boots squeaking on the frozen snow, your breath creating clouds that dissipate immediately in the dry air. The cold is dangerous at this temperature, exposed skin will freeze in minutes, but your fur clothing is adequate protection as long as you keep moving. Standing still is when you get into trouble, when the cold finds its way through the layers and starts leaching heat from your core. You maintain a steady walking pace, circling the herd at about 50 meters distance, watching for anything unusual. The wolf tracks from earlier are still visible, though they're starting to blur as wind-driven snow fills them in. You find fresh tracks about 100 meters north of the herd. A single wolf, possibly the same one from before, circling and watching but not approaching. Wolves are smart enough to know that a healthy, guarded herd isn't easy prey. They're looking for weakness, for opportunity, for that moment when attention lapses or when an animal separates from the group. Your job is to make sure that moment never comes. You think about wolves more than you'd like to admit. They're a constant presence in herding life, the primary threat to your livelihood, and the relationship between herders and wolves is complicated. You respect their intelligence and their adaptation to this harsh environment. You understand that they're just trying to survive, feeding themselves and their packs in a landscape where food is scarce and hard-won. But you also kill them whenever possible because they're a direct threat to your family's survival. There's no animosity in it, just practical necessity. The wolf wants to eat your reindeer. You want to prevent that. Sometimes the wolf wins, sometimes you win, and the ancient dance continues. One of the reindeer stands up as you pass, watching you with that slightly worried expression that reindeer have, like they're perpetually concerned about something but can't quite articulate what. You recognize her as one of the pregnant females, and you check her condition visually. She looks fine, healthy, moving normally. She settles back down once you've passed, rejoining the warmth of the group. The pregnant females are your most valuable animals right now. They're carrying next year's herd, and losing them means losing not just one animal but two. The night is profoundly quiet, that deep Arctic silence that exists when there's no wind, no human activity, nothing but the vast emptiness of the tundra stretching away in all directions. You can hear your own heartbeat, your own breathing, the small creaks and cracks of ice adjusting to temperature changes. This kind of silence can be unsettling if you're not used to it. It's too complete, too absolute, and humans evolved to live in environments with ambient sound. But you've lived with this silence your entire life, and it feels normal. The absence of sound means the absence of immediate threats. Silence is safety. You complete your circuit and return to the chum, checking the time by the stars. You've been out about an hour, which means another hour to go before you wake your son for his shift. You could go back inside and stay near the fire, but that means constantly transitioning between warm and cold, which is more uncomfortable than just staying cold. Instead, you gather a few pieces of firewood and sit on one of the sledges, positioned where you can watch the herd and the surrounding area while staying relatively sheltered from any wind. This is thinking time, the long hours of solitary consciousness that every herder experiences during night watches. Your mind wanders across topics without much direction or control. You think about your daughter and what her life will be like, whether she'll stay with herding or whether education and opportunity will pull her toward cities and wage labor. You think about your son and whether he has the temperament for this life, the patience and the resilience and the willingness to sacrifice comfort for autonomy. You think about your wife and how she's managed to maintain strength and skill despite the grinding hardship of this lifestyle. You think about your own choices, the path that brought you here. You had opportunities to leave, you had some education, you could have worked in town, you could have chosen a life with electricity and heated buildings and regular paychecks. But you chose this instead, chose to maintain the traditions and the knowledge and the lifestyle of your ancestors. Was that wise? Was it foolish? Historians still argue whether the preservation of nomadic cultures is an inherently valuable goal or whether people in harsh traditional lifestyles should be encouraged to modernize for their own benefit. You don't have answers to these questions, and you're not sure anyone does. The aurora intensifies, the green curtains becoming more active, dancing and swirling with increasing energy. You watch it for a while, appreciating the display despite your familiarity with the phenomenon. Science has explanations for the aurora: solar particles interacting with Earth's magnetic field, exciting atmospheric gases, producing visible light. But your grandmother had different explanations involving spirits and ancestors and messages from other worlds. Both explanations are probably equally valid in their own ways. The scientific explanation tells you how it works. The traditional explanation tells you what it means. You need both. A sound from the herd catches your attention. Not alarm, just one of the reindeer calling to another. A low grunting sound that carries clearly in the cold air. You watch for a moment to make sure it's nothing serious, and it isn't just normal social communication, reindeer being reindeer. The herd is calm, which means you can be relatively calm, though you maintain vigilance because complacency kills. Time passes slowly during watches. You've learned to occupy your mind with small observations and minor tasks. Counting stars, identifying constellations, noticing how the snow texture changes with temperature, thinking through repair projects that need doing. You can't let yourself get too absorbed in thought because you need to maintain situational awareness, but you also can't just sit and watch nothing happen for 2 hours because that drives you slowly insane. The balance is in this middle ground of soft focus, paying attention without straining, remaining alert without tensing. Your fingers are getting numb inside your mittens, which is the signal that it's time to move again. You stand and do another circuit of the herd, walking briskly to generate heat, flexing your fingers and toes to maintain circulation. Cold injuries are a constant risk at these temperatures. Frostbite can set in quickly if you're not careful, and managing your body's warmth is an ongoing active process. You can't just dress warmly and forget about it. You have to constantly monitor extremities, adjust layers, move around to generate heat, and pay attention to the early warning signs of cold injury. The herd is still calm, still in their groups, still doing the minimal movement required to maintain warmth while conserving energy. One of the bulls is standing at the edge of the nearest group, and you watch him for a minute to assess his behavior. He seems fine, just standing guard in that way that dominant males sometimes do, keeping watch over their portion of the herd. This is actually helpful. The reindeer have their own security system, with the most alert animals staying watchful while others rest. You and the reindeer are partners in this, working together to detect and deter threats. You check the time again by star positions. You've gotten good at this over the years, using the slow rotation of constellations as a clock, and calculate that your watch is almost over. Another 20 minutes and you can wake your son, return to the warmth of the chum, and grab a few more hours of sleep before morning routines begin. The thought of warmth and rest is appealing, but you don't let yourself focus on it too much because that makes the remaining time drag. Instead, you think about tomorrow's tasks, checking the sick reindeer, continuing repair projects, possibly moving to a different section of the grazing area if the section gets depleted. A shooting star streaks across the sky, bright and sudden, and you track it instinctively before it vanishes. Meteorites are just space debris burning up in the atmosphere. You know this intellectually, but there's still something magical about them, something that connects you to the vastness of the cosmos. You exist on this tiny frozen planet, in this harsh landscape, maintaining ancient practices in a rapidly changing world. And overhead the universe continues its vast operations completely indifferent to your existence. It's humbling and somehow comforting at the same time. You make one final circuit of the herd, moving slowly, checking for anything that might have changed in the past hour. Everything looks stable. No new tracks, no signs of predators, no indication of illness or distress in the reindeer. This is a successful watch. Nothing happened, which is exactly what you wanted. The best watches are the boring ones where you walk around in the cold for 2 hours and then hand off responsibility to the next person without any exciting stories to tell. You return to the chum and wake your son, giving him a brief report. Herd calm, no predator activity, temperatures dropping further but within normal range. He nods, pulls on his layers, and heads out into the cold while you shed your outer garments and return to your sleeping platform. The furs are still warm from your body heat earlier, and you slide into them gratefully, feeling the immediate relief of not being cold anymore. Your wife stirs slightly but doesn't wake, and your daughter is still completely unconscious in her nest of furs. Sleep comes more easily this time, now that your watch duty is complete and you can fully relax. You're aware of the fire crackling, the wind picking up slightly outside, the sound of your son's boots crunching on snow as he begins his circuit. And then you're sliding under into deeper sleep, your consciousness finally releasing its grip on vigilance, letting your body rest properly for a few hours before the cycle begins again. The night continues its slow progression toward morning. Outside, your son walks his circuits under the aurora and the stars. Inside, your family sleeps in warmth and relative safety. The herd rests on the frozen tundra, 800 animals maintaining their collective heat and security. The wolves, if they're out there, keep their distance, watching and waiting but not striking. The wind blows across the endless snow, carrying with it the cold of the Arctic night. And you sleep, finally, deeply, gathering strength for another day of the ancient work that has sustained your people for thousands of years and that you're maintaining for one more night, one more season, one more generation. The world is changing around you. Climate shifting, industries encroaching, traditional ways being eroded by modernity. But here, in this moment, in this frozen night, the old patterns hold. You're a reindeer herder on the Yamal tundra, just as your ancestors were, continuing a way of life that has survived empires and ideologies and countless winters. Tomorrow will bring new challenges, but tomorrow is not yet here. For now, there is only warmth, rest, and the deep satisfaction of having kept your family and herd safe for another day. The aurora begins to fade as the night reaches its deepest hour, those precious minutes before the first hint of dawn when darkness is absolute and the world feels suspended between one day and the next. Your son continues his watch, circling the herd with the patience born of lifelong practice. The reindeer shift and settle in their groups, conserving warmth, waiting for morning light and the start of another day's grazing. Inside the chum, the fire burns lower but never quite dies, maintained by careful tending and years of experience with fuel rationing. This is the rhythm of life on the tundra, days and nights flowing into each other, each one bringing familiar challenges that require unfamiliar solutions because conditions are never quite the same twice. The temperature fluctuates, the snow conditions change, the herd dynamics shift, and you adapt constantly, drawing on traditional knowledge while improvising new responses. It's exhausting and demanding, this life, requiring constant vigilance and endless labor. But it's also deeply satisfying in ways that are hard to articulate. The satisfaction of self-sufficiency, of maintaining ancient practices, of living in close connection to animals and landscape and the fundamental processes of survival. The stars will slowly overhead, their positions marking time's passage. The wind whispers across the snow, carrying scents and sounds from distant places. The herd breathes collectively, 800 sets of lungs maintaining the processes of life in an environment that seems designed to extinguish it. And you sleep, wrapped in furs, your family around you, dreaming perhaps of warmer seasons or perhaps of nothing at all. Your body recovering from the day's exertions and preparing for tomorrow's demands. This is one day in the life of a Siberian reindeer herder. Not remarkable, not unusual, just the daily work of survival and continuation. Tomorrow will bring another day much like this one, and the day after will bring another. The seasons will change, the migration will continue, and the ancient patterns will persist for as long as people like you maintain them. Whether that's another generation or another 1,000 years, no one can say. But tonight, in this frozen darkness, under these wheeling stars, the old ways endure. And that, perhaps, is enough. Sweet dreams, friend. May your own challenges seem a bit more manageable after spending a day in the cold with the reindeer and the endless white horizon. Rest easy, knowing that somewhere out there, someone is walking through the Arctic night, maintaining watch over their herd, continuing traditions that have survived longer than empires. And maybe, just maybe, that's something worth knowing about as you drift off to sleep in your own warm bed, in your own time, in your own place. The world is full of different ways of being human, and tonight you've walked, at least in imagination, through one of the most demanding and most ancient. Sleep well,